From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. 2 months ago, something very unusual happened. A football match, a big Europa League fixture that would normally be sold out, was instead played to a half-empty stadium.
Maccabi Tel Aviv fans have been banned from Aston Villa's Europa League clash in Birmingham over, quotes, safety fears.
West Midlands police said Maccabi Tel Aviv fans had been banned from attending the match because of a heightened risk to public safety.
There is a section of Maccabi fans, not all Maccabi fans, but a section of them who engage in quite significant levels of hooliganism.
But very quickly, there were serious questions being asked about the police's claims.
I found that one of Britain's biggest police forces used wholly made-up or misleading intelligence to justify a politically contentious decision, a ban on away fans attending a Maccabi Tel Aviv Aston Villa game last year.
That's Gabirel Pogrund, the Sunday Times Whitehall editor, who's been investigating this story. Now, following an official and damning investigation, the government agrees. In an extraordinary statement to Parliament, the Home Secretary announced that she wanted the police chief responsible to go.
The ultimate responsibility for the force's failure to discharge its duties on a matter of such national importance rests with the Chief Constable. And it is for that reason that I must declare today that the Chief Constable of West Midlands Police no longer has my confidence.
So how did we get here? What exactly went wrong with the police process around the decision to ban Israeli football fans? And what happens next? The story today: where does the Maccabi scandal leave the police? Gabirel, we've both just watched a very unusual statement in Parliament. What happened?
So Shabana Mahmood has just delivered as you say, quite devastating, excoriating and emphatic statement in which she's withdrawn confidence in Craig Guildford. He's the Chief Constable of West Midlands Police. And over the last couple of months, he's faced mounting scrutiny over the decision to ban Maccabi Tel Aviv fans from attending a game against Aston Villa last year. And what I discovered was that the intelligence which served as the basis of that decision was, if not made up, then dramatically exaggerated. In some instances it was made up. In other instances it was hallucinated by artificial intelligence. In other cases it was distorted in order to fit a political decision that the force was already minded to reach. And Shabana Mahmood appointed the police constabulary and inspectorate to examine this matter, and today the fruits of an inquiry have been published, laid before the House of Commons, and she has said that the evidence into what happened is so damning that for the first time in 2 decades, a Home Secretary has withdrawn confidence in a police chief, and she is actually going to change the law to restore the power of the Home Secretary to strip a Chief Constable of their duties.
That Home Secretaries should, in future, have this power restored to them. When a Chief Constable is responsible for a damaging failure of leadership, the public rightly expect the Home Secretary to act, and I intend to restore their ability to do so.
It was a devastating statement, as you say, almost historic. She's going to change the law to make sure she has the power to sack a Chief Constable. That's how angry she is. Take us back to where all of this began. You know, people watching that statement will want to understand how we got here. Take us back 2 months to a football match on the 6th of November. Where are we? Who's playing? And who isn't there?
The story, as you say, in some ways starts late last year, when there was a Europa League game. That's a sort of second tier of continental football. A game took place in which Aston Villa were playing at home, and the away team was Maccabi Tel Aviv, who are one of Israel's sort of better football teams. But the notion of that team coming to Britain's second biggest city, was deemed so contentious that there was some in the local authority that wanted the game scrapped on the grounds that their attendance would be a shot in the arm for Israel. It would amount to an endorsement of the genocide there. Of course, that's not the basis on which these decisions are made. So there was a much more technical decision made on safety grounds to ban away fans from attending, and the police threw their weight behind that. And as such, when the fixture took place, there were no away fans.
You said there was quite a technical process in the ban on safety grounds. Who was responsible for that?
So it's a great question, and I suppose in order to answer it, I have to burden listeners with a phrase which is so sort of technocratic that you will probably forget it moments after hearing it. But there is
Test us, go on.
There's this entity called a Safety Advisory Group, or a SAG, is a shorthand that has been referred to in conversations I've been having of late, which is a sort of multi-agency meeting before big football games take place, usually involving law enforcement, emergency services, the local authority, a couple of councillors. This body will get together and determine whether or not the local authority ought to issue a safety certificate. Usually that just gets given, but it is a requirement for certain football games and other large events to take place.
Yeah.
And in this instance, the Safety Advisory Group, behind closed doors, agreed that Maccabi Tel Aviv fans should not attend, and they were fortified in their position. Essentially, they justified their position on the basis of the local police force, West Mids, which had itself said that its preference was for there to be a ban on safety grounds. But if that sounds straightforward, it has turned out to be far more
Anything but
contested and vexed a matter than that.
Yeah. Well, so as you say, usually these certificates are issued as a matter of course. Occasionally, when there are questions about whether you can ensure public safety, they are withheld. We have had in the past, I think, Galatasaray wasn't allowed to play in Leeds. I really hope you're impressed with my football knowledge there.
Good pronunciation of Galatasaray. I mean, I'm not Turkish, but that was that rolled off the tongue. Yeah.
Hurrah. I like to pretend. So it's not unprecedented, but it's very rare for that to happen when there are very serious concerns expressed, usually by the local police, that they won't be able to police this match. What were we told at the time the advice had been from West Midlands Police?
At the time, they based the ban on what they refer to as intelligence, which they said was so compelling that they didn't feel they could police the level of disorder they anticipated. And they rooted that analysis largely in the events of the previous year, when there was another Europa League game involving Maccabi playing against Ajax, the biggest Dutch team based in the Dutch capital of Amsterdam. And there was large-scale disorder then. And they said that based on what happened there, on the scale, not just of the unrest, but the law enforcement response required, that they felt it was better for away fans to stay away from this game.
And when they announced that ban, what was the reaction?
You had Kemi Badenoch condemning it as a national disgrace, and Keir Starmer also saying that it was the wrong decision. On the other hand, you had a lot of people locally, foremost among them one of the pro-Gaza independent MPs in Birmingham, Ayub Khan, saying that it was the right call and that anyway, Tel Aviv, given their hooliganism, given their support for Israel's actions in Gaza, should never have been able to attend. So it was a little bit of a kind of, if you happen to be disposed towards the Jewish state or towards Israel, you probably were pretty sceptical about the decision. If you're on the other side, then your view changed accordingly.
The ban went ahead, despite even Keir Starmer wading in. At the time, when the football match occurred, as you said, there were some protests.
I think that there was some unrest. There were some protests outside the game. There was a much bigger police response than there would have usually been, given the controversy prior to the game. But there were people on the far right, and there were kind of local agitators, from Tommy Robinson to people suspected of being kind of Islamists who as a result of all this controversy, were drawn towards the game, but in the end, it mostly passed without incident.
Things seemed to go quiet for a bit. There were still questions in the background, and then you got involved. Tell us about that.
I hadn't even remarked upon the story or had any involvement in reporting on it in the first instance, but what really changed it was that I got leaked the underlying intelligence that was presented to the Safety Advisory Group to justify this decision.
And where had this intelligence come from?
So I suppose, just to briefly kind of give a small potted timeline, there were 2 Safety Advisory Group meetings in October. In the first one, those present said they were minded to ban the game, but they'd go away and do a bit of work and meet shortly thereafter to rubber stamp it. Then there was a second meeting where they did confirm the decision. That's what led to the condemnation from the PM and the leader of the opposition. Then there was a third meeting where they reviewed and reconfirmed the decision because of this scrutiny. And it was in that meeting that there was a written version of the intelligence which had previously been presented orally. So I got leaked that, with this document presented at the third meeting. And this was essentially presented in writing in response to all this national furore about the decision. And I remember looking through it thinking, I'm not sure I want to touch this story with the barge pole, it just, as I say, the atmosphere of high partisanship was a bit of a deterrent. But then the obviousness of the misinformation contained within it drew me in, and I remember just seeing certain details in it and thinking, this is just so obviously implausible.
What were the bits that really stood out to you?
So there are a few which I kind of lasered in on. One was this notion that Israeli fans had randomly chucked civilians into the river.
In Amsterdam.
In Amsterdam. So, forgive me, a lot of the intelligence was, probably 2/3 of it, focused on what happened in Amsterdam. And there was this idea that they'd thrown people into the river, and I did some research and couldn't find any notion of civilians being thrown in the river by Maccabi fans. There was also this idea that 200 of the fans were linked to the IDF, but there's military conscription in that country. So
I'd be surprised if the number wasn't higher.
Well, exactly. It would be higher. I mean, if you get 1,000 Maccabi supporters, you would assume that the vast majority of them, not necessarily through any choice of their own, would have been legally required to participate in a couple of years or 3 years, depending on gender, of conscription. So it didn't make any sense to me. There was also this notion that 5,000 officers had been deployed in response. And I just thought, again, that just seemed like a enormous number. By the way, there were Maccabi fans who behaved despicably, and I've always said this.
It's not a bad time to pause and just point out that, they do have a reputation for bad behaviour and chants which are very unpleasant. And this isn't about whether that decision was necessarily right or wrong. It's about the process.
Exactly.
Behind it.
Yeah, the one thing I've never wanted to do in this is sort of somehow exonerate every Maccabi Tel Aviv fan, A, at Amsterdam in 2023, but B, full stop. They have a rich tradition of ultra fan disorder. Ultras is sort of shorthand to non-football fans listening for the bit of the fan base that is the most passionate and the most hooliganistic traditionally. There was footage of them engaging in anti-Arab chanting at this game, targeting a taxi driver, hitting a vehicle with metal pipes, if I recall correctly. So, there's no doubt that there was also bad behaviour by Maccabi fans, and I never wanted to dispute that. But when I read this document, I nevertheless thought, but a lot of this just simply cannot be correct. And I suppose what then happened is I did a bit of old-fashioned journalism, which was, I'd been leaked the intelligence, I had suspicions about a lot of it, and I went to 2 parties, Dutch police and West Midlands police, and the response I got from them was interesting to say the least.
Tell us what they said.
So West Mids, from the very off, refused to engage in my queries in any details at all. And actually, from documents I've since obtained from within the force, I know that they described me as being quite irate and were plotting.
Is that an accurate description?
Well, I'll let you be the judge of that. No, to be fair, I don't think I ever found it. I was never personally that emotional about it, but at the time I was saying to him, you're just evidently not answering any of my questions, and it's my job to ask them. Dutch police, I should say, were wholly different. I emailed them and asked for a conversation with Sebastian Meyer, who is Amsterdam Police's head of communications. He's an expert in what happened. He represents the relevant bit of Dutch police that had to respond to the unrest in 2024. And he was brilliantly forthcoming and transparent. I walked him through the claims that were contained in the document, and he just went through them one by one and said, I don't recognise that. I definitely don't recognise that. That's misleading. That seems to be false and made up, but let me get back to you. That seems reasonable, that doesn't. And by the way, I mean, it was a massive domestic political issue in the Netherlands too. So much so that they probably didn't want foreign media casting doubt on what the Dutch authorities and Justice Ministry had found out through copious investigations of their own. So I think he just wanted to make sure that whatever I reported was done in a spirit of accuracy. But he did commit his comments to the record. I published them, and I suppose the rest is news, if not yet history.
And just describe the response to that story.
So I immediately had the support of Nick Timothy, the West Suffolk MP. He's a big Villa fan. He had been critical of the ban in the first instance, but I think he got the sense here that there was some sort of misconduct or malfeasance where it wasn't just that they'd made a decision that he disagreed with, which we can all accept happens from time to time, but he sort of also recognised that on a granular level there was something deeply wrong with that intelligence. And he tabled, he raised questions in the House of Commons, he amplified the story, and there were debates in both chambers, and Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary who oversees UK policing, was also sufficiently concerned that she asked the police inspectorate to specifically examine this case. And that's when kind of the scrutiny started to pick up, but it was some weeks or months until we really got a fuller, more multicoloured picture of what had happened.
How did that emerge, that fuller picture? Because, I mean, at one stage, you got a second leak.
Really, Craig Guildford, the Chief Constable of West Mids Police, was the architect of his own misfortune and actually helped our case when he was called before the Home Affairs Select Committee. Because I think at that time, there was a lot of interest among MPs on that cross-party committee and the general decision-making surrounding the game, but there hadn't been that much focus on what I've been examining, which was the actual intelligence and the extent to which it was or was not in line with reality. And I think that Guildford's own appearance before that committee, he made two, but his first was so self-defeating because he refused to answer certain questions, but then provided inaccurate answers on others. So, for example, shortly before the hearing, it emerged that one of the claims in the intelligence, namely that the last time Maccabi had played on British soil was against West Ham, and it emerged that game had never happened. And asked about it, Guildford had said that it was not the result of an AI hallucination, but rather the result of what he called social media scraping. But that just posed so many more questions because you think, well, what does that mean?
I think the accusation, well, not the accusation, the summation, I think in the House, it was a question that was asked in the House, was that, you know, you've used AI, or West Midlands may have used AI on this particular occasion. We don't do that. We don't use the AI.
So that was one thing. The other thing was he was just using language in quite an imprecise way to sort of forestall scrutiny of certain questions in ways that I could tell probably weren't going to withstand further inquiry. For example, the intelligence claimed that 5,000 officers were deployed in response. But Dutch police had told me that the full number for the entire operation was 1,200 people. And Guildford was asked about that. And instead of saying, you know what, fair cop, it wasn't 5,000, it was about a fifth of that, he instead said that that was a professional assumption but one that he stood by because of the expertise of his force.
And where the 5,000 comes from is exactly as you said, which is our professional assumption of our silver commander, which is over the 3 and 4 days of the actual event, you'd need about 5,000 police officers.
They had understood that 1,200 actually referred to the number deployed on a given day. So they multiplied it by the number of days that the police operation covered. And I just listened to that and I thought, if you didn't know what you were talking about, you might listen to that and think, oh, okay. But actually, subject it to the magnifying glass and it just didn't make any sense. And a few MPs got the impression also that he had not actually addressed their questions. So there are all sorts of things that he said to MPs that seemed, from his perspective, needlessly misleading. And when you mislead parliamentarians, mislead Parliament, then, you know, the wattage of the story increases.
Following that select committee, you receive another leak. Tell us about that.
This was a few days ago now. The second leak was the kind of unexpurgated minutes of the SAG meetings which preceded the decision. So they had released some of these minutes via Freedom of Information requests, but they had redacted, Birmingham City Council and West Mids in different ways had redacted the bits which, to a word, were quite inconvenient for them. I was given the full version. So, for example, on the 7th of October last year, the first SAG meeting took place, and the official published version wholly redacted a section in which West Mids Police was described as having preferred a ban from the outset. But they said they made that decision in the absence of intelligence. So essentially they just were minded to ban it, but didn't have the goods to support that decision at that time. I also obtained a letter sent 24 hours after the first SAG meeting in which Birmingham City Council has said to the police, we're all behind this decision, but we have been challenged a little internally on it, given the scrutiny it's likely to come under. So we need a slightly clearer rationale. Could you please give us some more information? So it was literally 24 hours after the decision had already been made that the local authority said to police, we're going to need to retrofit some evidence. That was, in terms, what was sought. The second SAG meeting, suddenly Amsterdam has this outsized importance. It had previously been referred to, but only in a kind of throwaway line, where suddenly it became the focus of the discussion. So when I was leaked that, I was able to say not only that was the intelligence flawed, in some instances false, but the intelligence was produced in writing after a decision had effectively been made.
And the investigation the government sanctioned does talk about confirmation bias. It sort of says that it's as if the police found evidence that supported a decision they'd already come to. There was also evidence, though, about local protesters and their potential behaviour.
That's a really, really important point. So I was looking at the evolution of these documents, and you see that things that did appear in the first meeting suddenly drop away in the second, and then they disappear from the third. I'll give you one example. From the earlier meetings, it was deemed that the threat to the Jewish community was high. The threat to the Muslim community was medium, and the threat to Maccabi fans was high. And in later meetings, that was turned on its head. So the threat to the Jewish community wasn't mentioned at all. The threat to Tel Aviv fans was downgraded to medium, and the threat to the local Muslim community was upgraded to high. So you can see that the actual facts were starting to evolve. But then there were things that just weren't mentioned at all. And one of them, which is something which has emerged in an official report since, was the fact that there were people within the predominantly Muslim local community who were, in the words of this report, prepared to take up arms in order to attack travelling fans. Now, that just was never mentioned at any of the SAG meetings, not certainly in the minutes and not in the written intelligence, and has definitely deepened the sense among some that the decision was made to please elements of the community who just anyway didn't want this to go ahead.
So, as you say, the official justification was about potential violence from the Maccabi fans, not about the potential violence from elements of the local community, that would change the picture. Still a risk if you're trying to police it, but it's a different picture that was being portrayed. You mentioned earlier, even some of the basic facts that they were stating, seem to have come from AI. Having said very firmly in that select committee that they hadn't, we have actually had, since then, an apology from the Chief Constable.
That's right. So that was on Wednesday morning, shortly before Shabana Mahmood made her statement. Guildford wrote to the Home Affairs Select Committee to say that an investigation had now revealed that Microsoft Copilot, which is Microsoft's kind of inbuilt AI assistant, had generated the West Ham game that never took place. Guildford had said social media scraping, which is a sort of term that some of your boomer MPs may not necessarily comprehend. And I thought that would be the final word on it, but clearly internally there was something that led Guildford to change his mind and acknowledge that was actually generated by artificial intelligence. So that was probably the most unwelcome news from his perspective, but news that he decided to disclose shortly before Mahmood made her statement.
So a few hours later, she stands up in Parliament, absolutely damning about this investigation that's been carried out and what it means for the Chief Constable in particular. She says she has no confidence in him. He has to go.
We have witnessed a failure of leadership that has harmed the reputation and eroded public confidence in West Midlands Police and policing more broadly. Faced by a game of such importance, the Chief Constable of the force, Craig Guildford, should have ensured more professional and thorough work was done.
Makes it very hard for him to carry on in that job, you'd imagine. But what actually happens next? What is the process?
It's a great question, and actually so far you've got the Home Secretary saying he's got to go, you've got Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the opposition, saying he's got to go, you've got John Cotton, the leader of Birmingham City Council, saying he's got to go. The one person who hasn't said he needs to go is Simon Foster, who's the Police and Crime Commissioner. That is a job that Shabana Mahmood has separately said she intends to abolish, but is essentially the person who appoints and then oversees the Chief Constable. Simon Foster has so far been very, very hesitant to criticise Guildford. So it seems like he is a sort of one person in this whole story who is rather reluctant to add to the sort of number of calls for Guildford to go, but he is the only person who actually has that authority. So there could be this astonishing situation, and this may change depending on Guildford's own kind of private considerations over the next 24 hours, but it seems like you can have a situation where the Home Secretary, who allocates resource to police, who supervises police, who represents the police, and the leader of the local authority and the leader of the opposition are all saying this man must go. But he is out there, it seems so far, trying to face down that pressure.
West Midlands Police has issued a statement saying the force wishes to apologise and it will work tirelessly to rebuild confidence. It adds that none of this was done with an intent of deliberate distortion or discrimination. Gabirel, this is yet another crisis for the police. What does that mean, to be in a situation where you could have a Chief Constable who, the Home Secretary has stood up, told the nation in Parliament she has no confidence in him, and he hasn't yet gone, as we're speaking. Is this a crisis between politics and policing?
And really, this is one of those cases where I'm not sure how to describe it. They have been caught with their pants down. They've been exposed making stuff up or using information that was wholly fictitious and inaccurate. So where does that take us constitutionally? Well, to a quite awkward place where politicians have felt the need to intervene and the Home Secretary has felt the need to withdraw her confidence. So I think it will pose sort of, in some ways, quite technical, but in other ways, quite cosmic and philosophical conversation about how does the state monitor law enforcement authorities, not least ones where things seem to go badly wrong, but where the man or woman at the top is not seemingly prepared to own that. And the other thing, which there's a separate subplot to this, which is the role of partisan actors in influencing police decisions. And I think that that's the one thing which had been concealed from public view before the decision was made was the involvement of people with a particular partisan political position on the kind of geopolitical question of Israel's actions in Gaza, and their role in influencing what masqueraded as a impartial law enforcement decision, I think has posed a much bigger question about the relationship not between law enforcement and politicians, but law enforcement and local communities, and how law enforcement at times, it seems, seeks to keep certain communities on side by making certain decisions which are then publicly presented as being, the inevitable decision of much even-handed law enforcement analysis. That is part of where this debate goes to.
That was Gabirel Pogrund, the Sunday Times Whitehall editor. And you can find all the Times coverage on this story and all the latest on West Midlands Police online at thetimes.com. The producers today were Olivia Case and Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Tim Walklade. And sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. Do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.